Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, gang. All right, welcome to week 12. This many plus imagine if I had two more fingers. Yeah, we are in the home stretch. So as this is the first video of the week, let's see where we are, where we're going, or where we were, where we are, and where we're going. To your courses. All right, so when last we spoke, well, hopefully if you're keeping up, if you're not, the previous video. When last we spoke, it was week 10. Forum discussion was due. It was done. You did great. But we were talking about the Hashemite kingdoms, and we ended up talking about the problems in the Hijaz. We're going to pick up from where we left off. So this PowerPoint right here will be applicable for the material for this video. Last week, reading week, yay! I hope that some of you guys were able to relax a little bit. Which means, again, we're in week 12, which means I'm doing this on the 15th, which was Monday, so Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, 4 days until your primary source assignment is due, and I just had a moment. Yeah, 4 days. Sorry, math in my head is going, wait a sec, that's 19. Nah. Thursday the 18th, your primary source assignment is due. Use the excerpts here to answer the questions here. See? Nice and simple. So in this video, we will be continuing on with our discussion of the Hashemite kingdoms, but looking forward, we're going to continue talking about, we're going to start talking about China, continue talking about China, and then, oh, look, the 2nd of December, your research paper is due. That is in 1, 2, 3 weeks. So if you have just sort of left off your research paper after your annotated bibliography and just sort of put in the deep freeze, take it out of the deep freeze, start looking at it, maybe start jotting down an outline of what you want to write about, however your writing process is. Final exam will be the 21st of December, so 19 days after the last day of class. I will be providing the outline, not the outline, the study guide, there we go, for the final exam on the 2nd of December come week 14. So that's where we are, that's where we're going. So let us stop sharing and start sharing where we were. All right, so in our previous discussion, we were talking about, well, let's go way back to the beginning. So in our discussion, there we go. In our discussion about World War I in the modern Middle East, we were talking about the background to the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century. We talked about the 3 major promises made by Britain, the 3 voices in the chorus of the Middle East: McMahon-Hussein Correspondence, Sykes-Picot Agreement, Balfour Declaration. And then we started talking about the mandate system, one of the 2 ways that Europe tried, or not Europe, England tried to reconcile all these conflicting promises. Talked about that in the previous video, so I won't go over it again. Then we talked about the problems in the Hijaz and why you today don't hear of or know of a country known as the Hijaz. Talked all about that, which brings us to Syria and Iraq. Because this man here, right smack dab in the middle, that is Faisal bin Hussein. That is Hussein bin Ali's 3rd son. Faisal was the leader of the primary military leader in the Arab rebellion against the Turkish Ottoman Empire, and indeed went to France as the leader of the Arab contingent in the negotiations at Versailles. So some of you were questioning, well, why didn't Lebanon or Syria have anybody there to speak for themselves? Well, they did. They had Faisal bin Hussein trying to negotiate the Arab the Hashemite position of, you promised us this big amount of territory. What the WTF? So Faisal was one of the more politically astute Arab leaders, Hashemite leaders. And so when he went to Versailles, he was determined to ensure Arab sovereignty in the region promised by Britain during the war. Now, for Faisal, his concern was less about who controlled the territory, provided it was controlled by a Hashemite ruler, one of his family. But his concern was more about the fact that it was Arab controlled. If the Arabs were unable to get a single unified state as promised by the McMahon-Hussein correspondence, Faisal was prepared to accept a number of smaller Arab states ruled by a member of the Hashemite family. Now, as I said, Faisal was one of the more politically astute Arab rulers and understood that effective control on the ground was tantamount to the acceptance of control over the state. Because remember, back in the mid-1880s, 1885, 1886, Europe had this whole Berlin Conference, and coming out of that was this idea of effective occupation. So what Faisal attempted to do in 1918, 1919 was to sort of set up an effective occupation of Syria so that they can go and go, look, just like you guys did with Africa, we have effective occupation of Syria. We have an effective government, we have an effective police, we have everything that should, by all rights, go along with this idea of effective occupation. Because in 1918, Faisal's forces, along with the British, had captured Damascus, Syria, and Faisal was determined to set up an Arab state as soon as possible to set up effective occupation and make sure that the French don't just go, hi, this is ours, get out. May 1919, elections were held in Syria for the Syrian National Congress to sort of set up an effective government in Syria. Now, this body, the Syrian National Congress, was determined to establish a national parliament for Syria, effective government, and to preserve the Syrian state as Greater Syria as opposed to Lesser Syria. Now, what do I mean by that? So this is the Ottoman Empire and sort of how they sort of broke things up. I mean, you've seen in the reading in the podcast regarding what Syria and Lebanon were like prior to French occupation. What would become Syria was broken up into a number of different provinces. So we have Aleppo, we have Damascus, we have basically Lebanon, Grand Lebanon or Beirut, and another province along the coast. For the Syrians, for Faisal, although he was a little wishy-washy about that, he wanted to make sure there was a Hashemite ruler. But for the Syrian National Congress, they wanted a greater Syria. They believed that Syria, we'll take out Palestine there. They said, well, that's something different. But they believed that the entirety of this territory, including parts of northern Iraq, were part of a greater Syria. So Greater Syria refers to a state comprising the modern day nations of Syria, Lebanon, parts of Israel and Palestine, as well as Jordan. So I mean, basically this whole entire area outside of Mesopotamia, they believed should be one entire state. So Greater Syria refers to a state comprising the modern day nations of Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, and Jordan. While a lesser Syria refers to a separate Syrian state. So basically this part right here, with the other areas being independent and sovereign as well. The Syrian National Congress, again elected May 1919, had a majority of Faisal supporters and therefore approached Faisal to become the first king of Greater Syria. Unfortunately for the Syrian National Congress, unfortunately for Faisal, 1920 was a bad year for Greater Syria. It was a bad year for Faisal and a bad year for the hopes of a Greater Syria. So, with respect to England and France, they had an agreement. The Anglo-French agreement in 1919 required Britain to evacuate territory that would become part of the French mandate, Syria and Lebanon. And the British evacuation, the pulling back to borders within British mandated territory, forced Faisal to enter into negotiations with Georges Clemenceau of France. Key terms, hard words, but Clemenceau, Georges Clemenceau of France. And in January 1920, Faisal and Clemenceau come to a compromise. That's how you spell Clemenceau, by the way. They come to a compromise. They come to a compromise agreement where France would acknowledge the existence of a Syrian state. The Syrian state would be, for all intents and purposes, a quasi-independent state within the French Empire. France would basically allow Syria to have its own domestic policy, would allow Syria to have its own rulers, and France would agree not to station French troops in Syria. This would not be an occupation. This would be a compromise where the Arabs will control, Faisal and the Arabs will control Syria, albeit with a French influence. Provided, so in exchange, Syria would agree that the French government would be the only European government to provide military and economic assistance to Syria. So even though Lebanon is sort of broken apart, Syria would remain an Arab-controlled state with Faisal at the head. And so Faisal and Clemenceau agreed to this compromise. Faisal returns to Syria and goes, hey guys, guess what? I have an agreement. France will sort of not stick its nose in our business. We're going to be more of a sovereign state. We have control over our domestic. And why are you guys growling at me? Yeah, the news of the compromise did not go over well with the vehemently anti-French and vehemently pro-independent supporters of Faisal. And Faisal was forced and pressured to renege on his commitment to France, which did not endear Faisal to France. Because now France can go, look, we had an agreement. You went back on it. There's no way we can trust you anymore. On the 7th of March, 1920, Faisal was proclaimed the king of the Arab Kingdom of Greater Syria. And the next day, on the 8th of March, Syria declares itself to be an independent and a sovereign state. The next month, in April 1920, the Western powers of Britain, France, Italy, and the Eastern power of Japan meet in San Remo, Italy, to discuss the status of the former Ottoman states, as well as some other issues dealing with the Pacific. That's why Japan was there. But for our purposes, we're going to focus on determining the status of the former Ottoman states. It is at the San Remo conference in Italy that Britain, France, and Italy explicitly acknowledge French control over Syria and Lebanon, and provided France with international support. Britain and Italy as two other members of the victorious Triple Entente. Obviously, Russia is having its own issues, and the United States has gone into isolation after Versailles. So France is provided with international support for France to use any and all military and economic forces against Faisal and the Syrians. And so after the San Remo conference, France issues an ultimatum to Syria. Capitulate or else we are going to dogpile you, essentially. 14 July 1920. Worried about the status of the Syrian state and the Syrian people in the aftermath of an extended conflict against France, Faisal accepts the ultimatum. He surrenders to France and abdicates his position as king of Syria. Sends out the orders to his government. We are surrendering. We do not want to fight the French because we want to make sure that the Syrian people do not suffer an extended war. I mean, they're going to win anyway. We don't want the Syrian people to suffer. And the defense minister goes, okay, I hear what you're saying. I respect what you're saying, but no. Not going to do it. Not going to capitulate to France. And the defense minister refuses to acknowledge Faisal's orders and leads the Syrian army against the French. As you can tell from this PowerPoint, the fighting lasts a total of 10 days as French forces enter Damascus on the 24th of July, 1920. Things will work out for Faisal in the end. As the British, concerned with the growing problems of direct rule in Iraq, 1920 was a bit of a bad year for Britain in Iraq because, well, they had a bit of a rebellion that they had to really put down militarily and went, okay, we cannot directly rule Iraq. Well, what if we put in somebody who we could influence? Well, and we'll see how this works. They'll go, well, why don't we put Faisal in charge of Iraq? So things do work out well for Faisal in the end. As the British decided to shift away from directly ruling Iraq to the more tried and true method of indirect rule, having a supportive member of the elite, a pro-British member of the elite in power, and offered to make Faisal king of Iraq. Now, most Iraqis had no idea who Faisal was, but thanks to British tricks and machinations, Faisal gained 96% of the vote on whether or not to accept him as king of Iraq. And as king, Faisal started a modernization program in Iraq. He brought in experts from Syria, many of them who fled after the French takeover, to help establish a modern educational system in Iraq. Although this did create a fair amount of resentment against the Syrians by the Iraqis, he helped introduce modern infrastructure, modern roads, modern railroads, modern pipelines, so that you could get oil from the oil fields to either Basra and the Persian Gulf or along to the Mediterranean Sea. So the major urban areas were connected via road or rail. He introduced and modernized the urban areas as well, including sanitation, where instead of dumping refuse into the Tigris or Euphrates River, you would have a modern sanitation system. And he westernized the military along British lines. British were supporting Iraq militarily, so it makes sense to, if you're getting British guns, British airplanes, British tanks, you might as well make your army look like the British. And Faisal was a fairly effective ruler for Iraq, shepherding Iraq from being a mandate of the British to independence, to Iraq as an independent state in October 1932, before Faisal will die of cancer the next year in 1933. So that's what happened with respect to Syria and Iraq. Which brings us to the Transjordan. The Transjordan will be the most effective of the four Hashemite kingdoms. The Hashemite kingdoms of the Hijaz, Iraq, Syria, and Transjordan. Out of the four, Jordan is the only remaining Hashemite kingdom that is still around. Its official name is the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. Interestingly, it will also be one of the smaller and more vulnerable of the Hashemite kingdoms, and it is due to the political maneuvering of King Abdullah, that is Faisal's older brother and Ali's younger brother, so the middle of the three brothers. The political maneuvering of King Abdullah, as well as King Hussein, Abdullah's successor, who ruled between 1952 and 1999. So really, you'll have King Hussein's father in there for a little bit, but really between 1921 and 1999, you'll have two major rulers in the Transjordan, later known as Jordan. And so, how do we get Abdullah on the throne? Well, it comes down to the Cairo Conference. The Cairo Conference in 1921. The second of the two ways that Britain tried to reconcile its competing promises was the Cairo Conference. On the one hand, you had the mandates trying to reconcile these. On the other hand, you have the Cairo Conference trying to also reconcile the promises. So this is going to be the second of the two ways that the British attempt to resolve the conflicting promises between the McMahon-Hussein correspondence, Sykes-Picot, and the Balfour Declaration. The Cairo Conference is going to be how Faisal will be placed on the throne of Iraq and how Abdullah will be put on the throne of the future Jordan. Because into this picture we bring Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill will be the newly appointed colonial secretary, the person in charge of the colonies, including the mandates. And Churchill had to figure out how to solve the growing British problems in the early 1920s. One of the problems he had was in Britain. I'll actually show you the man. He had this man right here, T.E. Lawrence, Thomas Edward Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia. Fought along with Faisal, fought along with the Hashemites as a liaison for the British during the First World War. He liaised between the Arab revolt in against Turkey and the British military. And as such, he was aware of the McMahon-Hussein correspondences and exactly what McMahon promised the Hashemite family in order for them to engage in a revolt. And so in Britain, in 1919, more so 1920, Lawrence is going around Britain giving talks about what it was like living amongst the Arabs. But he's also railing against the British government, saying, we made a promise for the Arab people. We made a promise to the Hashemite family that if you guys engage in a revolt against the Ottomans, we will guarantee your sovereignty. And Lawrence is going, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the mandate system, it is overriding these this promise that we made to these people, it's not right. Do the British people not have honor? Do they not honor their promises? And the people that he's talking to are going, huh, yeah, yeah, you're right. We honor our promises. We went to war in 1914 because of a 80-year promise to Belgium that we will protect its sovereignty. We bled and died over a promise. Therefore, we should honor our promise to the Arab people. And more people were starting to talk this way. And so this became a political problem for Churchill as colonial secretary and for the greater British government, where you have people writing to their MPs, pressuring their MPs to go, look, this is a British promise. We gave our word, and now we're going against it. No, that is not the British way. So Churchill had to figure out a way to deal with Lawrence of Arabia. In Iraq, as I mentioned, there is going to be a full-scale insurgency against the British in Iraq, as they are trying to directly control Iraq. The Arab people in Iraq, and this is a cross pan-religious with respect to the Sunni-Shia divide. This is a pan-religious revolt, a pan-Iraq revolt. It's happening all through Iraq, a revolt against British rule, and it's only through the use of the Royal Air Force and the bombing of entire villages that this revolt is put down. So Churchill is going, okay, I have problems in Britain, I have problems in Iraq. Oh, what else can go wrong? Well, what else can go wrong is with Abdullah and Jordan. Because in Jordan, Abdullah is starting to make noise about invading Syria to reinstall his younger brother Faisal as king of Syria. And Churchill is going, no, you can't do this. If you do this, it would be a British ally invading French territory from British-controlled territory, and we're trying to rebuild. We're trying to not have any tensions between France, and such an invasion would exacerbate tensions between Britain and France at a time, during a time that both are recovering from the war. So you have problems in Britain with Lawrence of Arabia, problems with an insurgency in Iraq, problems with Abdullah and other Syrian refugees joining his army and going, yes, let's invade Syria. Let's put Faisal back on the throne. And then you have problems in Palestine. 1919 to 1924, you have the issue of Jewish immigrants continuing to arrive in Palestine as part of the Third Aliyah and starting to exacerbate tensions between Arabs and Jews in Palestine. So Churchill is just going, oh God, what did I get myself into? Why did I agree to do this? Okay, I have to fix this. And to solve these problems, Churchill convened a conference in Cairo, Egypt, that brought together all senior British military and civilian officials in the entirety of the Middle East. So he brought in every major British military and civilian official to Cairo to sort of figure out what they're going to do. Now, to solve the problem in Britain with respect to Lawrence going around and basically drumming up problems for Churchill, to co-opt T.E. Lawrence, Churchill approached Lawrence and said, Lawrence, Larry, T.E. Thomas, Tommy baby, I don't know anything about the Middle East. And the smart people that I talk to all said the person you need at your side advising you is Thomas Edward Lawrence. So Lawrence, T.E. Lawrence, I am coming to you and I'm going to play on your ego. And I apologize, there is a snowblower outside of my window. So I'm going to temporarily pause it until he is done. He's back. All right, sorry about that, guys. They were snow blowing and scraping the ice off the sidewalk outside of my place. All right, so getting back to the Cairo conference. So to co-opt T.E. Lawrence and his campaign, as I said, he was buttering him up and basically said, look, I need you. I don't know anything about this place. You're the smartest person that the smart people said to talk to. And so Churchill appointed Lawrence as his special advisor. If he's in Cairo, he can't cause any problems in Britain. With respect to Iraq, it was decided at the Cairo conference that it was decided to end the official mandate in Mesopotamia, that is, end official British direct rule, and as we have seen, install Faisal as king of Iraq and institute effective indirect rule of Iraq. Britain still controls it, but through a pro-British monarch. Now, it's Transjordan and Palestine. The area constituting Transjordan, modern day Jordan, so basically everything east of the River Jordan, and Palestine to the west of the River Jordan, were officially part of the British Mandate of Palestine. Now, Abdullah and Churchill met several times prior to the Cairo conference, with Abdullah pressuring Churchill to put Abdullah in charge of the entire Mandate of Palestine. In other words, put Abdullah in charge of this whole kit and caboodle. Abdullah's army had been growing with the arrival of Syrian refugees who found in Abdullah a supporter who wanted Faisal back in power. In the end, Abdullah agreed to not invade the French Mandate of Syria in exchange for the territorial control of the Palestinian Mandate east of the River Jordan. So basically, River Jordan right there, everything to the east of that would become part of Faisal's kingdom. And Britain would continue to support an independent Hashemite state of Transjordan. And with these maneuverings, Churchill would go on to claim that the spirit, if not the letter, of the promises made to Hussein, the Sharif of Mecca, were fulfilled with his sons Abdullah and Faisal, each receiving their own kingdoms. But the Transjordan still had problems, or what would become Jordan would still have problems. And the biggest problem for the Jordan Emirate was the precariousness of its location and its borders. On the west, you have the British Mandate of Palestine, that is future Israel. To the north and northeast, you have the French Mandate of Syria and British Iraq. And to the east and to the south, you have Saudi Arabia. With the problem with Palestine is you have Arab nationalists in the Transjordan who want Transjordan and Palestine as to be reunited, while some Zionists in Palestine eyed Transjordan as part of the territory that was promised by the British. These revisionist Zionists, as they were called, wanted a Jewish state that controlled both banks of the Jordan River. With respect to Syria, the Transjordan was initially, again, part of this idea of Greater Syria, and Syrian nationalists wanted Transjordan as part of their territory. This caused problems between the Syrian nationalists in Jordan, who still wanted Abdullah to invade Syria, and Syrian nationalists under French control, who wanted Jordan under the French mandate as part of a bigger Syria. And with respect to Iraq, Iraq under indirect control of Britain, while Britain wanted to build an oil pipeline between the oil-rich mandate of Iraq All right, I'm going to stop recording here. I just had a bit of a power outage. So I'm going to stop here and I'll pick up my discussion in the next video. Actually, lights still look like they are on. So I'm going to continue my discussion then. That was weird. All right, I have